of webinars. And in case you missed the previous ones, you can find them on the Pacific Resilience Partnership Facebook page. The topic for this evening's webinar is From Data to Action, Harnessing Data for Implementing the Pacific Regional Framework on Climate Mobility. For those of you not familiar with the Climate Mobility Framework, it was endorsed by forum leaders in 2023 to provide policy guidance on a rights-based and people-centered approach for anticipating, preparing for, and responding to the impacts of climate-related mobility in the Pacific. Way down in paragraph 46 of the framework, leaders recognize the need for accurate, timely, and disaggregated data, including multidimensional and multi-sectoral risk and vulnerability assessments that are also linked to appropriate funding to ensure well-informed decision-making and effective implementation of the framework. And our webinar today will focus precisely on these matters, including what kind of data is important, how that data can be collected, the resources required to get it, and how we can use it to implement Pacific Regional Framework on Climate Mobility. And we have an excellent lineup of speakers to help us think through such questions. First, we'll hear from Bradley Malika from the IOM, who will provide an overview of how data can drive decision-making on climate mobility based on his experience working across the Asia and Pacific regions. Next, we'll hear from Natha Spaeth, who will share some work being done by IDMC and SPC on displacement data. Third, we'll hear from Lemba Ngaunabinaka, who will share insights and lessons from the experiences of the Fiji government. And finally, we'll hear from Christopher Bartlett, who will discuss measuring non-economic data, including biodiversity degradation and loss and damages. Before we begin, just some brief housekeeping. Each speaker will have about 15 minutes to present, which should leave us with around 20 to 30 minutes at the end for any Q&A. And we're using the webinar format today, so should you have any questions for the panelists, please do type them into the Q&A function and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as we can. Also, just to let you know, in addition to the now 109 participants online that I can see joining us, I'm also speaking here at PIFS where we're having a watch party that includes some participants who are attending a regional consultation over the next few days on implementing the regional framework. So a big shout out to everybody upstairs, drinking kava and sipping on the wine. So without further ado, please allow me to introduce our first speaker. Bradley Malika is head of the IOM's Climate Mobility Innovation Lab in Asia and the Pacific. Prior to this position, Brad was Senior Regional Emergency and Post-Crisis Specialist in Asia and the Pacific, focusing on a series of issues linked to disaster risk reduction, emergency preparedness, humanitarian response and recovery. Prior to that, he worked with IOM in Iraq, overseeing large-scale work related to internal displacement, stabilization, recovery, and durable solutions. Earlier, Brad worked in the private sector, supporting renewable energy projects in developing markets. Held several other positions in the IOM, including in Guinea, Cameroon, the Philippines, Haiti, Timor-Leste, and with the Office of the Prosecutor at the UN International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague. Brad holds a BA in History and Political Science, a Juris Doctor of Law, and an MA in International Human Rights. He's also admitted to practice law in Colorado, USA. And despite that quite daunting introduction, I had the pleasure of seeing Brad speak in Bangkok recently, and he's excellent in making difficult things sound simple. So Brad.
Thanks so much, Tim, and all the PIFS colleagues and others for the invitation to speak to you today. With that introduction, I hope I live up to expectations. But I want to talk a little bit about displacement, specifically, and human mobility more generally in the context of climate change. In particular, data on this topic, its importance, the gaps that we find in terms of availability of data on this topic, and ultimately what can be done with this data. So I want to start first by talking a little bit about what we know about climate change and forced population movements. I'm going to share with you a few statistics, some of the things that we do know, both as it concerns Asia and the Pacific as a whole, as well as statistics that are available for the Pacific specifically. We know, for example, that 12.6 million internal displacements took place across Asia and the Pacific in 2023, 90,000 of which happened in the Pacific. Over the last 10 years, 177 million internal displacements took place across Asia and the Pacific, of which 615,000 took place in the Pacific. We know that our region, Asia and the Pacific, is the region that experiences the most internal displacement related to disasters or climate-related impacts around the world. The statistics that I cited, though, relate principally to rapid onset events, things like cyclones, floods, landslides, and so on, and don't really include, to a great extent, slow onset impacts of climate change. For that, we have some projections that are available, broad numbers that have been produced by different sources. For example, the World Bank has cited the figure of around 90 million people who may have to move as a result of the slow onset impacts of climate change between now and 2050 in a worst case scenario, meaning no meaningful reduction in carbon emissions, basically. We have information on all of these statistics, but at the same time, we know that not all displacement is bad, right? A lot of those numbers are mixed in with those numbers of people who evacuated prior to a cyclone, for example, right? And while we classify those people who may have moved to an evacuation center for a few days during the worst of the cyclone, for example, and then returned home afterwards, they get classified as displaced people. But that is, from our perspective, and I think from the perspective of most governments, sort of good displacement, what we would consider to be life-saving and important. So I just cite a few of those statistics to highlight what we know in terms of internal displacement, in terms of some of these dynamics. But what we don't know, I think, are there's a few points that I'm going to highlight that I think are quite important as well. We don't have a real great idea of the impact of slow onset processes, at least insofar as numbers are concerned. Numbers of people who move as a result of the slow onset processes linked to climate change. Part of the reason for that is the line between voluntary migration on the one hand and forced displacement on the other is fairly blurry. It's not always a clear-cut case as to whether somebody has moved as a result of climate change impacts, as a result of socioeconomic conditions, some of which may have been degraded by climate change, but also other factors, and so on and so forth. So complicating this situation further is the lack of clear distinction, I think, between what is voluntary and what is involuntary in the context of these population movements. And then another related issue is what is attributable to climate change and what is not attributable to climate change, or at least not only attributable to climate change. We see many examples of disasters occurring in the Pacific and beyond, where the media narrative, for example, is often around, oh, climate change has made cyclones or typhoons more intense and more frequent, and that's undoubtedly true. But what is also true is that we've seen tremendous population growth around the world in the last several decades, last several generations, for example, large-scale urbanization, changing socioeconomic and demographic conditions, and so on, all of which also contribute to the impacts of disasters. So I'm painting this picture now to try to, I guess, highlight the complexity of the topic that we're trying to understand and ultimately trying to address. So with those sort of brief statistics and challenges in mind, I want to talk a little bit about what we're trying to do about it. We as an IOM, and in particular the structure that I manage, the Climate Mobility Innovation Lab, which is new in IOM. At its core, what we really want to understand is who is likely to have to move in the future as a result of the impacts of climate change. Where do they live now? And where are they likely to go in the future? Those three questions, those three bits of information are, first of all, very, very hard to understand at this point with any kind of degree of certainty, or at least with the degree of specificity that would allow us to act on this information. That information, we think, is essential to underpin policies, underpin programs, and support activities that serve to achieve and some of the objectives that many governments and international organizations share, which I'll talk about in a moment. But this relates to things like prevention over the long term. For people who don't want to move, is there anything that can be done, or what can be done to target assistance, target adaptation financing, target disaster risk reduction resources, and improving preparedness, for example, over both the long and the short term. So we come from a place where data, like I talked about before, is available on a macro level, but perhaps not sufficiently specific or not sufficiently granular for us to act on it in the ways that we would need to do so to support populations to stay, if that's what they want to do, or in many cases support things like planned relocation and so on. If we take a sort of quick zoom out, I think we look at this question or frame it from, I think, 4 sort of broad objectives, right? The first is around prevention. Who's likely to have to move in the future? Where are they living now? And what can ultimately be done to help them prevent or not have to move? We also know that many people have already moved, especially those from who have moved as a result of slow onset impacts whose movement may not have been tracked or identified as such either by governments or international partners. What can be done to support those populations to better integrate into their new locations? In certain cases, people face challenges related to accessing livelihoods. In certain cases, there's insufficient housing or basic services. In some cases, there are tensions or social cohesion issues that may arise in the new location, etc. What can be done to identify the people who have already moved and support their integration into new locations? The third, and I think closely related issue, is around if people are likely to move in the future, where are they likely to go? And with this information, we think support programs that can render locations that may receive large-scale influxes of population more receptive in the sense that some of these issues that I just mentioned, housing shortages are addressed before they take place. Same thing with access to livelihoods and basic services, and so on. So, and then the fourth is really around these sort of second-order impacts or secondary impacts of climate change, in particular as it relates to climate security. What are the impacts that climate change has on security and vice versa. We see this issue emerging and manifesting itself in various ways in the Pacific. There's been some interesting work done in various countries in the Pacific on this question as well. So from there, I want to talk a little bit about what we're trying to do. The first program that we've put in place is called RICD, or the Risk Index for Climate Displacement. This is something that is led by IOM and the Climate Mobility Innovation Lab, but it's done through co-creation, namely through a network of university, academic, and other partners who have come together to try to put in place a methodology that can help us increase the accuracy and the granularity of data related to the risk that populations face of having to move in the future. So really trying to address some of these data gaps that we mentioned before. This co-creation methodology is, we consider it fundamental. We have many universities, including several from the Pacific and other partners. I see a few people on the call today who are part of this group. We think of co-creation as, first of all, from the perspective of efficiency and cost effectiveness. We want to be able to access a wide variety of disciplines, of domain expertise, in a way that isn't the sort of normal way of doing business, which may be, bringing in external consultants, which is useful in certain respects, but we also want to sort of build upon and leverage the existing resources, expertise, and understanding of national institutions. And then there's also this principled component, which is really around, from the perspective of the UN, at least in our opinion, we think that the best way for data like this and programs like this to be structured and to be created is through in a leadership role, those who live and experience and ultimately will have a responsibility to address in the future. There's this expression that gets used, I think sometimes in aid circles, nothing about us without us, right? And from our perspective, we see our role as IOM as more of a convener. Can we bring together experts? Can we bring together those who are most impacted by displacement and the impacts of climate change? And together we can sort of co-create and develop solutions to these problems. The second component after RICD, the question is, we have this granular data, this more accurate data on future population movements. But what do we do with that? Obviously, that type of data can have significant significant utility, let's say, in terms of enhancing national policies, local strategies related to disaster risk reduction or climate change adaptation, emergency preparedness, for example. We're also working closely with PIFs and other partners to try to integrate some of these tools into the Pacific Regional Framework on climate mobility, which from our perspective is an excellent example of regional collaboration. And as a sort of side point, I think we see this as a model that can be used in other regions. We don't see this level of organization necessarily in other regions. But in any case, with that data, from our perspective, we're creating the Climate Catalytic Fund, the CCF, and this is really designed to support local level adaptation. Where can we invest limited resources to maximize the impact on some of those objectives that I mentioned earlier, preventing displacement, addressing displacement that has already occurred, creating more receptive locations, and so on and so forth. So I will summarize just by mentioning that both RICD and the CCF, they're currently in pilot phase in Southeast Asia, in a couple of countries, but very soon we're going to launch them in the Pacific. As I mentioned, we've been working with a series of partners there to contextualize, to make these tools both appropriate for and useful to actors in the Pacific. So I hope I have an opportunity to speak more about these programs and these tools, and hopefully present some of the results and the findings in separate discussions with many of you on the call today. But I will wrap up there. Yeah, and just to mention that we see this problem of obviously human mobility in the context of climate change, and more specifically the data on it, as quite fundamental, both from the perspective of understanding the challenges that many people in the Pacific and elsewhere will face or are currently facing, and then what can be done about it to alleviate suffering, prevent displacement, and ultimately contribute to broader efforts at sustainable development. I will stop there. I think there'll be time for a Q&A at the end, but I'll pass back to Tim. Thank you again so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Brad. That was excellent. And yes, just for everybody in the room, we'll be taking all the questions at the end. So don't worry, if you've typed them into the Q&A now, we'll start from the top and work our way down. And Brad, I really, again, just to summarize, you know, you asked those same three questions when I saw you speak in Bangkok, and although you rightly say that actually getting the data is not easy, the simplicity of those questions: who is likely to move, where are they now, where are they likely to go, and then once you have that data, the decision making that then enables down the line, whether staying in place or preparing for relocation, is really important. So thank you for raising those, and also for, as I said, paragraph 46 talks about getting the data and linking it to financing and decision making. And so we certainly look forward to the outcomes of your pilot projects, which I believe will be Fiji and Vanuatu. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly.
Excellent.
And I'll be there in a month or so hopefully we can discuss in more detail. So, thank you.
Great. Looking forward to it. I hope everyone at the watch party has got a drink in their hand, and please don't be afraid to huddle around the screens if you need to. Our next speaker will be Nathaniel Spate, who is the Regional Advisor on Disaster Displacement for the Platform on Disaster Displacement, or PDD. He previously served with the IDMC, and he can explain what that is, for the last 5 years, where his focus has been on generating evidence and strengthening data systems to address data displacement actions at the national and regional level. Another, over to you.
Bulavinaka, everybody, and thank you, Tim. Allow me to share a bit of my reflection in my previous dual role with the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. Adding to Brad's point earlier, the 6th assessment report on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in March 2022 noted with high confidence that climate and weather extremes are increasingly driving displacement in all regions, with small island states disproportionately affected, and increasingly driving displacement in all regions with small island states disproportionately affected, and that in the mid to long term, displacement will increase with intensification of heavy precipitation or rainfall and associated flooding, tropical cyclone, drought, and increasingly sea level rise. Further, if you've read through the Pacific Regional Framework on Climate Mobility, you would have seen that according to IDMC figures, it is anticipated that over 50,000 people will be displaced annually in our region if we continue to follow the current emission pathway. This was the figure recorded in 2022 before the framework was approved in 2023. In an alarming trend in 2024, IDMC was already recording over 60,000 displacement in November before the end of the year, an indication that displacement is a growing figure and is a growing concern in our region that warrants our urgent attention. In IDMC, displacement risks work in 5 countries in the Pacific from 2020 to 2021, and it basically refers to displacement risks in Solomon Islands within the next 10 to 15 years. There will be about 15 to 20 years. There will be about over 4,000 people being displaced, and the same thing with the Marshall Islands, Tonga, Vanuatu, and Fiji, with alarming number of people being displaced. With this, although these figures are quite telling, they're extremely underestimated given the lack of reporting from the countries. And secondly, it doesn't reflect all the hazards that triggers forced movement of people, especially flooding. The flood displacement risk assessment work was then conducted in 2022 in Vanuatu and Fiji to understand how flood-induced displacement will look like in the next 20 to 50 years in different climate change scenarios in selected urban areas in Fiji and Vanuatu. It basically forecasted that displacement situation will basically double in these selected areas, with both the rural and urban areas being affected. It was noted that livelihood and access to services such as education and health triggers the forced movement of people. In the same vein, a report by ADB and IDMC in 2024 on harnessing development financing to displacement in the Asia-Pacific region notes that displacement hinders and may even reverse development gains for affected individuals, communities, and countries. The cost of displacement includes not only the economic impact, like lost wages, but also non-economic, indirect, and long-term consequences in displaced individuals, host communities, and those left behind. For example, IDMC estimates that each day of lost wages due to disaster displacement in Asia and the Pacific cost regional economies 275 million. All this to say that displacement is not only a critical humanitarian issue, but a growing development agenda that requires an integrated and multidisciplinary sets of evidence and data to inform inclusive actions and durable solution. Displacement data and analysis, particularly those that are time-sensitive, contextual, and granular, is necessary to effectively implement the Pacific Regional Framework on Climate Mobility. However, data-related challenges and related knowledge gaps in the Pacific are hindering the capacity of countries to meaningfully monitor, measure, and manage risks and losses related to population displacement associated with the adverse effects of climate change. This includes issues to do with availability, quality, and accessibility of data, the definitions and approaches behind its collection and capture, as well as the capacity of, in terms of the knowledge, the tools and resources to collect and analyze it. All data analysis related to displacement are most often done externally, outside of government system, and raw data sometimes don't sit with mandated government entities. While historical data is good as the risk, it won't be useful in anticipating risks for the future. We currently have insufficient displacement risk information that is necessary to inform future planning and strategies at all levels of governance. While I've mentioned a few, it is far from being useful to guide effective implementation of the commitments under the Pacific Regional Framework on Climate Mobility, particularly on displacement commitments. At the same time, displacement is an issue that cuts across other policy agendas and commitments at national to regional levels. Displacement-related data and knowledge required for climate action can both draw on and contribute to progress data and assessment issues in implementing the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent, for example, the FRDP, the Boy Declaration, the SDG, the Sendai Framework, the Global Compact on Refugee and Migrants, among many others. Such data and knowledge is necessary to inform the implementation of the framework, which needs to be evidence-based and actionable to avert, minimize, and address all forms of climate mobility, especially displacement. At the same time, we have a lot of good practices, a lot of existing mechanisms that we need to strengthen in order to integrate displacement indicators. And we have developed methodologies and guidance on the collection of displacement related to data and assessment that may be drawn on and adapted to the needs of particular countries and contexts. However, it is currently scattered, and accessibility is a huge challenge and issue for countries that are currently wanting to pursue the pathway to developing their own policies, SOPs, and so forth. Generating actionable data is of limited value if it cannot be used where needed. It is important that data are targeted and they are useful for the end users. Ensuring decision makers and operational actors' capacity and commitment to use the data in policy and programming is critical. This is where IDMC has collaborated with SPC to develop a decision support tool around displacement, firstly as a conversation starter to the bigger centralization and accessibility conversation on all forms of climate mobility data. The PDD and IDMC also recognizes the important role played by regional and sub-regional organizations in addressing disaster displacement in line with the respective mandate and international standards and commitment, hence these collaborative efforts with SPC. What you see on the slide here is basically a mock-up of what is envisioned to be a decision support tool for countries that are pursuing ways to address disaster displacement in their own countries. This initiative actually came out of a consultation and co-design workshop with key stakeholders. Some of them are in the call today, including the author of the scoping report for this particular initiative, and who were during that time identified the displacement. So the 5 countries that were consulted included Fiji, Solomon Islands, the Marshall Islands, Tonga, and Vanuatu, who were during that time identified that displacement is a major issue that they need to address, and there was an important need for scientific data and evidence. This decision support tool will start off as a repository of displacement information, including risk information, but also have interactive features that generate real-time displacement estimate by country that is synced to IDMC Global Internal Displacement Database to provide some level of baseline during any response period of disasters, but more so during the recovery efforts of our government counterparts. This is an effort to also centralize a lot of the data, the methodologies, and the tools that are out there to guide government in how to consistently monitor and report on disaster displacement scenarios in country. The tool's vision, though, is to map out decision points in addressing displacement and other forms of climate mobility, including planned relocation and migration, and cluster this information and data accordingly. Further, it also envisions to provide useful information to countries wanting to access further information and guidance relating to displacement and other forms of climate mobility. So its scope is beyond just addressing the data and analysis need around disaster displacement. It is also important to shift the mindset from more humanitarian to more development mindset in terms of addressing displacement and other forms of climate mobility. As I mentioned, that in order to leverage disaster development financing, it is important to couch humanitarian disaster displacement agenda in the economic context or in the development context. And we need to focus on data analysis and research that helps understand the cost of not doing anything on climate mobility now versus the cost of trying to react to it in the future. So it's important. So I again reiterate the need for contextualized, for more granular, and for more consistent availability and accessibility of displacement data in order to implement the Pacific framework on climate mobility in the Pacific. I'll stop there, team, and I'll contribute and respond to any question and answers later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nala, for that excellent presentation, and you're getting some thumbs up, some virtual thumbs up, claps and hearts. So it was well received by the participants online as well. And in particular, your excellent point that you started with, that data can be limited if it can't be accessed when needed. And so the support tool is a great initiative to try and link the two, linking data to action in almost a real-time way, which is so important. And certainly for the implementation of the framework on climate mobility, we're looking forward to learning the lessons from the tool you're working on and see if there's ways we can build upon it for the broader project on implementing the climate mobility framework. So thank you so much. Our next speaker will be Lemba Gauna-Binaka, sorry, from the Fiji government. I don't really have a bio for her, but just to link her presentation to, we've heard from Nada and Brad about getting the right kind of data, the granular and contextualized data, and being able to use it for decision making. And for those of you who don't know, you will soon, that Fiji is certainly leading the way in being able to do this, leading the way across the globe, I would argue. So really looking forward to hearing from them.
Bulan Bulanak, everyone. Hi, I'm Lemba, and I am with the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. Delighted to be part of this panel, and thank you to PDD and IOM and our partners for organizing this webinar. If I can go straight to the next slide. Thank you. So I'm invited to share Fiji's experiences, and I'd like to begin by setting the context for Fiji in terms of what we currently have in place in terms of the legislations, the policies, operational guidelines, the risk assessments, the tools and financial mechanisms that Fiji has at the moment to guide our national response in addressing climate-induced planned relocation. And I'll touch specifically on the comprehensive risk vulnerability assessment and the collection of data around that. But in terms of background legislations, we have the Climate Change Act 2021, where Section 12 requires that relocation is only considered when all other feasible adaptation options have been exhausted. So this section of the Climate Change Act, which is now in force, further specifies the provisions for responding to climate-induced human mobility in Fiji's context, and what the roles and responsibilities are for all the key partners and government agencies that support this process. So we also have the Climate Relocation of Communities Trust Fund. In that diagram, there are two legislations mentioned. The Climate Change Act in purple in this slide, and the Climate Relocation of Communities Trust Fund Act 2019. This legislates and establishes the CROC Trust Fund, which is the financing mechanism to carry out this work. It's dubbed as the world's first trust fund dedicated to supporting communities affected by climate change and requiring relocation. And this trust fund is seed funded by the government of Fiji through 3% of revenues that's collected from some prescribed goods and services that fall under high carbon emitting industries and services. So there's a 3% tax that's charged on that that comes directly to the trust fund. So that includes things like departure tax, plastic levies, super yachts, levy that, super yachts that dock in Fiji's waters. So this 3% is then topped up by development partners or other sources of funding, since the CROC Trust Fund is positioned as a multi-donor fund that can receive from both domestic and international sources. So at the moment, the bilateral support that we have in this fund is coming from NZ, New Zealand MFAT, which has enabled the operationalization of the SOP that we currently have, and the current relocation project that is happening in Nambawatu in the northern part of Fiji. So we have these legislations, then we have those policies, the climate change policy 2018-2030. We also have the guidelines, the planned relocation guidelines, the displacement guidelines, and then more recently the SOP that was launched. So with all these policies, the legislations, the policies, and the financial mechanism, then we have the coordination machinery there through the work of the Fiji Task Force on Planned Relocation and Displacement. This is a cross-ministerial body that decides on relocation-related matters, guided by the SOP, and they are responsible for advising the minister on taking on relocation matters and ensuring the mobilization of funding from the Croc Trust Fund in compliance with the financial management policy guideline that accompanies the Croc Trust Fund. Next slide, please. Also, task force has a technical, even though it's a cross-ministerial working technical advisory body, it is informed, or there's an advisory body to that called the Technical Working Group of the FDRD, which is made up of members of basically everyone that works in this space, so including development partners and PDD, IOM, GIZ, all the other actors that that support the work in this space. Yeah, so we have this SOP functioning as the modus operandi, launched in 2013, basically outlining the processes to guide Fiji's work on this. It took 4 years to develop, from 2019 to 2020, and now basically paving the way for ensuring that we have a human-centered, science-based and climate-resilient approach for the relocation of our at-risk communities. So some key messages that stick out from those articles that are on that on this slide relating to the launch, relocation, more long-term rebuilding than rehousing plan, and the consent processes that need to be in place before a relocation is approved. You can go on to the next slide. So there are 17 steps across 3 key phases in this SOP that outlines all the roles and responsibilities of all the government agencies involved, and the key stages from the screening, from the initial request, triggering the request, and the screening, scoping, and risk assessments that you see there in step 3, and then the comprehensive vulnerability assessments in the step E. So altogether, 17 steps. Next slide. I probably won't go into the details because it's pretty lengthy, but if there are any questions on any of these parts, I'm welcome to go into details. All right, so this 5th slide is on the required consent. So there are 6 consent processes across the SOP, reiterating the principles that are woven into the SOP. Considerations of free, prior, informed consent to ensure that we have a community bottom-up approach, and ensuring human rights-based approach in terms of ensuring we collect disaggregated data, as well when we do the consultations that we hear from all members of the community, including the vulnerable segments, and the forms, the consent forms that's also collected. All the 6 consent form requires that we also collect this gender disaggregated data, male, female, and others if they wish to declare that in the form as well. There's also the livelihood considerations to ensure that the place that you're moving them into is safer and more conducive for long-term, for rebuilding their lives, that you'll be moving them to a site where they are moving away from the risk zones, and ensuring that it's also conducive, and then they are supported in terms of not just the psychosocial support, but also livelihood opportunities that can be that they can be supported with. So there are all those considerations as well that would be part of the relocation planning. And there's that preemptive approach as well, the other dimension of the principles of relocation that's considered in the 6 consent form, ensuring that you preempt any risk beforehand and any grievances are addressed as well. There's a grievance redress mechanism, and there's a process around that as well. So this 6 consent from the initial trigger, communities have to request, agree that this is just the living residents. We have to have 90% of living residents trigger the request before government can then come in and do the relevant assessments, and the recommendations determine the next couple of steps. And then the rest of the consent form requires 60% from the members of that community, those that are residing in there and those that may live outside. So the details of what basically what we're collecting in those consent form are on that slide. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. So besides the SOP, there are other subsidiary documents to assist the task force in undertaking the relocation decisions. There are also tools to help the government agencies that are going out into the field and carrying out these assessments. We have subsidiaries supplementary documents like the Culture and Gender Relocation Nexus report that is out. It's on our portal. It carries a lot of lessons from the 6 communities that had been previously relocated, more on an ad hoc basis. So there were a lot of lessons, takeaways from that informed this process, this SOP as well, in looking at ways we can improve this going forward. There's also a child safety and protection checklist that is currently being worked on, led by UNICEF, working with the technical working group of the task force to guide facilitators that would be carrying out this work in the communities in terms of being sensitive to the plight of the child and how you carry out these consultations in consideration of that. There's the cultural sensitivity checklist, ensuring that there are a lot of lessons also from previous communities where they were probably not so receptive to some of the interventions that government came up with, although well-intended, because of some mishaps or things that were seen to not have been, culturally sensitive. So these are things that have been taken on board, and then we are having these supplementary documents to help equip all actors that are going out into the communities to undertake and carry out these assessments and collect the data that's needed to better inform this process. The other documents that you see on that slide relates to the management of the trust fund. There's also a public community brief for the public and community brief for donors. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we have the 6 steps of the comprehensive risk and vulnerability assessment methodology. It starts, sorry, I can see it starts with defining the scope and values. So here we are looking at the climate scenarios, and we get a lot of this data from Fiji Met. Sorry, I'm having issues with my screen. Step 2 is determining the hazards. So in the CRVAM document, we have outlined 13 prominent hazards that impact the Fiji group, but for every community, it depends on the combination of hazards that impact that specific community. So in this assessment, you will select the relevant hazards that we're dealing with. So it's a multi-hazard, basically this is a multi-hazard risk assessment methodology. Yeah? So you determine the climate scenarios and the SSPs and RCPs from step 1. You define the scope of what you're covering under the assessment, the scopes and values. And then you go into the hazard scenario, the hazard assessments. And then step 3 is about the exposure modeling. And then step 4, the vulnerabilities. So for a lot of the data that will be informing this, besides the hazard modeling, there are a lot of data is coming from the, if I may explain, when we conduct the CRVAM, we do a pre-field briefing workshop with all the agencies that will be jointly undertaking this exercise. So we are all on the same page about the hazards that that this community faces. And then we collect all our data, all our baseline data. So it can come from various sources, from Fiji Bureau of Statistics, from the village profiling data, from other existing surveys that have been done by all the different partners. And then we have a desktop background before we go into the community. When we go into the community, there's we conduct through tablet a COBO survey that then collects a more comprehensive set of data that also validates the information that we may already have from our baseline. And so all this data is then collected, and then we have after the field work, we have a post-briefing workshop to then collate all this other information from all the agencies that have been collecting their bids. And then we aggregate them and consolidate this information to then inform the matrix, the table that will then determine if this community meets the most urgent risk threshold to then be supported by the trust fund for relocation. So this is just ensuring that when we are relocating a community, that we have explored all other options, and that relocation looks like the only feasible option that would be said, that we don't see potentially any other maybe adaptation option that can potentially prolong the need for them to relocate, or protect or avoid altogether the need to relocate if there's no other feasible measures. And then we recommend relocation as the measure of last resort, but it's informed by the data. And then the last consent form for the community to reconfirm that relocation is the option that they still want after the findings of the CRVM. So there's a report back that needs to be done after this week in the community. The climate change office then presents the findings back to the community during a report back session to then get their views and consent to reconfirm the relocation decision if they still wish to proceed with that. So it's that holistic approach, and there's a lot of actors that are involved in this. It's not just climate change office and the Ministry of Rural and Maritime. There's MRD, there's Ministry of Waterways, there's Water Authority of Fiji, and all the other key agencies that have assets that will be affected or that can help with mitigation or adaptation options as well when we are conducting these assessments. Next slide. I'm sorry, in the previous slide, I forgot to say that in the last step, we will redo steps 1 to step 5 at the new site as well, if the new site has been identified. Okay, next slide. These are just some quick snapshots of the exposure modeling, like with flood hazard. So there's multiple hazards. So if we are conducting for a community that is facing coastal erosion and flooding, we will do the flood modeling, and then the erosion risk assessment as well, and then collect that to then aggregate as annual average losses for that community. So there's a point that's tagged on every building that is part of the part of the scope from step 1, and that you then add an annual average loss value to that. And that's part of what the data that comes out of these surveys will help inform. Next slide. And so this is Nambuna village in Koro. This is on the left is the dots that is on the houses, looking at the different hazard types. I don't know if everyone can see this, but there's the tropical storm hazard, there's the wind hazard, there's the earthquake risk, but there's none there for the slide on the upper left. So depending on what hazard is applicable for this community, and then you, based on that, you will calculate the average annual loss values based on the percentage that you get from this. Yeah, next slide. I think that's the end of it. Thank you.
That's Bradley said earlier in his presentation about the importance of drawing on local examples and capacities and efforts, and we really are privileged in our region to have Fiji as a world leading example in how to go about addressing climate mobility using data to drive decision making, and also linking it to resourcing and action, most importantly. Just one question for you, if I could. The the Fiji government portal that has all the information. Are you able to type that into the chat for people so that they can
Oh yeah,
access
sure.
it
I'll do
later,
that now.
please? Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I'm almost lost for words because you've already said it. It's such a remarkable example. And, you know, we had a regional consultation back in September on the implementation plan. And, you know, one point that was raised by the member countries there was there's already a lot going on in the region, and we're very keen to learn from each other. You know, the kind of peer-to-peer support in supporting each other to develop policies and act on climate mobility. And certainly Fiji has a lot to teach us, and we need to find a way that you can help us learn that doesn't overtax you guys back in the office there. So thank you so much for sharing Fiji's experience. We really appreciate it. Our last but not least speaker is Dr. Christopher Bartlett. Chris is a senior technical advisor and climate negotiator for the Republic of Vanuatu, working for more than 2 decades to support island communities address environmental challenges. He holds a PhD from James Cook University and a postdoc with Nobel Prize laureate Elinor Ostrom, who, if my research is correct, Chris, disproved the idea of the tragedy of the commons in the context of natural resource use. So Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim. And it's a real pleasure to have so many friends and colleagues on the call. Incredible. And also humbling to come after Fiji, who really, truly is a gold standard when it comes to thinking about displacement and relocation. So I will bring you some stories from Vanuatu, particularly around the issue of data related to climate loss and damage. And if you've read the mobility framework, you will know that paragraph 4 is all about loss and damage. And I think our leaders had great foresight as they were drafting this paragraph. So for those of you who don't know where Vanuatu is, we are a small island developing state in the Pacific region. We like to think of ourselves as a big ocean sustainable state. And of course, we're home to rich biodiversity and incredible tapestry of culture and custom. But sadly, we are also very much on the front line of the climate crisis. And the impacts of climate change really, truly are bringing horrific losses and damages to our people, to our islands, to our communities. And much of that loss and damage is in fact non-economic. And when we talk about non-economic, we're talking about loss of livelihoods, loss of educational opportunities, the undermining of human rights. We're talking about the loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services, really things that matter most and in fact are existential for the cultures and identities of our people. In fact, some of these issues to our languages and loss of indigenous practices are some of the most consequential impacts of climate change in our country. So I will now talk to you about how Vanuatu has been thinking differently about data that is able to help us better understand some of these non-economic losses and damages. So you may have heard about Vanuatu's efforts to quantify development gains, not using traditional economic measures, but rather instead looking at the things that are most important to our people and our society. So we came up with the well-being indicators, and we have used them subsequently in all of our major development planning, in our National Sustainable Development Plan, but also in our major statistical censuses and other information. And these include things that are important for life, happiness, whether or not you have access, for example, to your indigenous lands or access to marine and terrestrial resources, whether or not you possess traditional knowledge or you have certain skills, whether or not you have access to health and food security, et cetera. These are the things that Vanuatu is really trying to understand in terms of our development measures. Another interesting example of data, innovative data in Vanuatu, is trying to understand how climate change is related to the protection of human rights or the undermining of human rights. And we've done some really interesting studies to try to link the human rights that are captured in international treaties and obligations to the impacts that people are feeling. And this was a study that was published recently in Nature Climate Change, really exemplifying how people's rights are being undermined. And in fact, this information went all the way to the International Court of Justice in our advisory opinion case, which is in the final stages at the moment. I wanted to talk to you also about some work that we've been doing with post-disaster needs assessment. And this is a story from the island of Santo that was absolutely smashed by Category 5 Cyclone Harold. And as you know, the post-disaster needs assessment doesn't do a fantastic job when it comes to some of those intangible losses and damages. And what we found, of course, in the communities that were most affected is that biodiversity, food security, these traditional sacred sites were some of the things that had been most impacted by this disastrous cyclone. And so what we did was try to add measures and add qualification and quantification of some of those biodiversity environmental losses and damages by novel techniques. First of all, we didn't have any access to this area. And so it was those of us who were actually on the ground when the cyclone struck that were forced to really take the lead in collecting this information. And that was community leaders, it was indigenous environmental networks, et cetera, literally going around as best we could, boats and horses, to get to these communities that had been impacted, and doing something completely different. And that was collecting data on environmental services that had been impacted. We were looking at the water supply sources, the food materials, whether or not the environmental services like pollution control or erosion control had been impacted by the cyclone, and using some of the latest science from natural resource economics, we were able to put a quantification on the provision of those services. And unbelievably, we found that the essential costs to the environment, or the losses and damages to the environment, dwarfed the costs that were being reported in the PD&A for things like infrastructure and schools and other economic activities. And so this is the real cost of these climate impacts, is really being untold unless we're using these novel metrics and collecting the right data. Obviously, that has pretty serious implications on the amount of money that's required. So biodiversity typically doesn't get funding after these major climate events. This, for example, you can see the graph here, several cyclones that affected Vanuatu, and in blue, the column, this is in millions of dollars, the economic cost, versus in orange here, the amount of money that was actually provided for response in terms of humanitarian aid. And so there's a huge gap. And this gap is being met by people themselves in the villages who really don't have the resources and are shouldering the vast majority of the burden. So this type of information, this novel data, can actually help us understand what those finance gaps are. And maybe to finish off, I'd like to tell you some of the things that Vanuatu is doing to try to move ahead in this data poor environment. We've just put the new loss and damage policy online for consultation. You can find it on the Department of Climate Change website. And it's really one of the first in the region that does a lot when it comes to filling these information gaps. You'll see the second chapter kind of in the loss and damage policy is around the assessment of loss and damage, including assessment of non-economic losses and damages, assessment of slow onset event impacts, as well as trying to understand the impacts of traditional knowledge. We've got a section in the policy on displacement, relocation, mobility, as well as a section on the human rights implications and climate justice implications of loss and damage. So I would encourage you to have a read of this policy. I think it's really forward-looking, and hopefully we'll be able to implement our regional framework on climate mobility. Moving into the action beyond policy, we've made the first request to the new Santiago network on loss and damage. This is a network that was established to try to provide technical assistance to developing countries who are dealing with loss and damage. And our request, which was made back in 2023, but probably in the next days will be signed and we'll start the work, is to actually understand what Vanuatu means by loss and damage, the entire range of activities that could be included for responding to loss and damage, as well as trying to get a handle on some of the capacity and knowledge brokering gaps that we have. And then the result of that analytical work will be the preparation of the first proposal to this brand new UN fund for responding to loss and damage. And in fact, I'm just on the way back from the board meeting, where, if you haven't heard yet, the board has decided that this year they will be launching a call for proposals of around $250 million for developing countries to begin to address their loss and damage needs. So I hope that the Pacific will be thinking now about applying and get ready to get resources from this new fund. Maybe in closing, I'll just talk about two examples of relocation, which I personally have been involved in, both terribly sad and tragic. This first one, the village of Molboy, which was in that cyclone area where we were doing those environmental assessments. And because of the lack of funding that just wasn't available after the cyclone, this community, when they experienced a horrific landslide, which buried the community, there were simply no resources available to help them cope. And they were forced to, they were displaced essentially and covered all of the costs on their own without any support, any financial or technical assistance. Another example of relocation, which we're involved in right now, is the village of Maro on Amau Island. And this village is stuck between the ocean and the lagoon, and the last several cyclones have absolutely decimated the village with sea waves passing through the doors and windows of every single household, the kindergarten. The graveyard is gone completely. But luckily, now we're starting off on a process of planning, moving this community within their ancestral 10-year boundaries to a safer location. And hopefully we're learning a lot of lessons from Fiji, using their SOPs and their guidelines to help us through this process as Vanuatu begins to develop its own processes. So from Vanuatu, from the people of Maro and the people of Molboy and all the communities in Vanuatu, thank you so much for organizing this call. And we hope that we can get better data that helps us make better decisions for the lives and livelihoods of our people. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Christopher, for that wonderful presentation. And, I think Another made the point earlier about the importance of contextualizing data, which, as I'm sure everyone online is well aware, means, in the Pacific context, means not simply the scientific data, but also traditional ways of valuing knowledge, the environment, and cultural practices. So it's really amazing to see how far Vanuatu has come with that, including efforts not only to value non-economic loss and damages, but also, I think, rethinking what counts as economic loss and damage. I thank you also for highlighting the important financing gaps that exist at the moment. We may have the data that we need, and communities certainly have the data and information they need, but sometimes don't have access to the financing to support them. And your point really highlights the resilience of Pacific communities in addressing climate mobility themselves as well. Also, the first day of our workshop today was on human rights and climate mobility. So I'm sure the participants of the workshop took a lot away from your presentation, and we've got some tools that we can learn from Vanuatu. And finally, I just wanted to say thanks for the inside knowledge on the Fund for Loss and Damage. And again, I wish Vanuatu all the best. You've lined up your ducks perfectly, hopefully to draw on those funds, but hopefully there'll be opportunities for other Pacific Island countries to learn from Vanuatu's experience as well, and put themselves in a good position to be able to access that as well. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for hanging in online. We still have 123 of you, which is awesome. And hopefully those in the watch party are still there. We have about 25 minutes for Q&A. I think some of them have already been answered. 7 of them have already been answered by the panelists online, so thank you. But we have an anonymous question here that's open to any of the panelists. And the question is, what ways can higher education institutions in the Pacific region contribute to the ethical collection, analysis, and application of climate mobility data to support the Pacific region framework? And how can they address challenges related to capacity, collaboration, and community trust? So perhaps Nada, I don't know if you would like to have a go at this one, or Bradley, you've mentioned that you're working with some universities in the region. So how can we work with universities to help collaborate on collecting the data that we need, I guess is the question. Thanks,
All right,
Nava.
jump in. Yeah, I'll jump in first, Tim, to say that IDMC and PDD have benefited from the regional structure that we have at the moment, which is the Technical Working Group on Climate Mobility, where we've used it as a platform to validate most of our data, but also to enable and facilitate connection and network in country and even at subnational level. So that's been working well for us. And we've also realized and recognized that a lot of academics are part and members of the Technical Working Group. And I won't hesitate in sort of recommending as a starter for continuing to engage and exchange in this space. Thank you.
Nava. Brad, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, sure. Just quickly. I mean, first of all, to mention, yeah, indeed, we've been working quite closely with academia in the Pacific and in around Asia and Pacific and beyond for the last year or two in a much more concerted way, I think, than before, especially around these questions of data collection, analysis, and application as the question states. So I think, I mean, we will have, there are events like this. There'll be, we will have as IOM several events coming up both in the Pacific and in Bangkok. There will be others too. I mean, from my perspective, I've seen the benefits of being able to collaborate much more closely with academia and with higher education institutions. So I think the more that you can, put your hand up, so to speak, reach out to either UN or to government or to regional organizations or to others, attend events, and put yourself in these processes. I think that, I mean, from our perspective, at least, there's lots of space for that. We'd be happy to collaborate with you, certainly, and hopefully others as well. Obviously, you guys have a much more, I think, vested interest and knowledge in the countries than an organization like ours would have. So there's clearly a lot of value, and we look forward to that. Thanks.
Thank you. And just a reminder too to those online and the person who asked the question, we're in the process of developing the implementation plan for the regional framework on climate mobility. And so on the issue of data, certainly if you can reach out to the regional organizations and share your capacity and willingness to support, that'll be great, because we know that it can be expensive and be require a lot of technical resources. So all the support, the existing support that's available will be most helpful to the countries. There's a question from Evelina who asks, is there an existing protocol for data sovereignty for each of the countries of the Pacific? Not sure if maybe Christopher or Lemba could answer that one. If in the relation to the data collection you've undertaken, does your government have a data sovereignty protocol?
I think it depends on the data. Yeah, it depends on the data and we do have the Fiji Geospatial Council and the FGTech Technical Advisory part of the council that does list fundamental data sets that can be shared. So these are fundamental baselines that can be shared publicly. There are granular level of data, of course, with every government department. Every government department has its own archive of data, and even sharing between government agencies, you will need to formalize that request through the permanent secretary responsible for that ministry to see the level of detail that they are able to share. There are fundamental data sets and there are those granular ones that can often, yeah, it depends. And yeah, but you can always put in the request and things. And for the hazard models, it depends on the partners that are supporting with those modeling as well. A lot of the open data with SPC is helpful, but there are other partners as well that do a lot of these hazard models. So it depends on those partners on their data protocol related policies. Yeah.
Thank you. Christopher, do you have anything to add?
I might just say that some of the data that we're seeing now with the Maro community is so incredibly personal that it's not even being shared within the Department of Climate Change itself, there are only 1 or 2 researchers who have access. I mean, things like the individual personal items that have been lost when the water washed through the house, or how much time, labor someone is able to spend given their disabilities in various forms. So a lot of this will never, ever reach, not even beyond national boundaries, certainly let alone departmental sharing. So it's very complex, and a lot of it is highly confidential.
Thank you. And that does raise an important question, particularly when it comes to data on traditional knowledge and practices about at what levels does data sovereignty exist? Is it a national sovereignty issue, or is it does sovereignty rest with the community? I think that's probably an important question to be wrestled with. Another we have, oh, sorry. We have a greeting from Pefi King to you, Natha. Bula Pefi, thanks for joining in online. I think this was a question that came up after another as well, around somebody asked, is this initiative in line with the Climate Reality Project by Al Gore? Is there any link, Natha, between your work and Climate Reality Project?
Currently, there's no in terms of collaboration, but yeah, there's no direct link with the Al Gore project. But would be interested in how we can find out opportunities, particularly on socialization of data. And I understand that Al Gore is good in terms of taking those scientific data and translating it for the benefit of those at even at subnational level, and making it understandable and digestible. So would be interested to explore avenues to collaborate, but nothing direct as we speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Natha. There's another question for you, Natha, which maybe you can respond to. You can type in the answer. It comes from Marita Manley, who would be very keen to talk to you further based on some work that she is also doing. Will Carter has a question for Lemba. Lemba, if you're listening. He says the Kroc Trust Fund is a leading example of a nationally owned financing model for climate displacement. I'm sure lots of learning opportunities for other nations considering this option. What opportunities or expectations are there for other donor governments or international financial institutions to further capitalize the Kroc Trust Fund directly rather than setting up another grant-making platform? Are there any additional data collection or data analysis requirements that might improve the Kroc Trust Fund?
Hi, thanks, team. We have had information sessions with a lot of the bilateral partners that we have based in Fiji, to socialize the Kroc Trust Fund, the modalities, the reporting requirements, etc. We have, of course, we had a lot of sessions raising awareness on the Kroc Trust Fund during COP as well, because it was fitting with the theme of the Climate Finance COP. There has been a lot of interest, but so far we still have New Zealand as the as the bilateral partner that has put a lot of funds into the Kroc Trust Fund. We're still hoping that other donors can come on board. Fiji did submit this Kroc Trust Fund as the case study to the Transitional Committee on the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, which also helped with the discussions and securing our place on the board. But there's still these are still being explored, other modalities and other ways donors can come on board and support this. There's a lot of donor support towards adaptation, but for the Kroc Trust Fund, it's seen more as a loss and damage kind of funding, and it is often, yeah, at the moment there's a challenge of getting in more funds directly to that. But yeah, we remain optimistic. Thanks.
Thank you, Lemba. And thank you for raising an important point there for people to think through as well about, is climate mobility, maybe it's not an and/or question, but is climate mobility an adaptation issue or a loss and damage one? Which has implications, of course, for different types of funding sources. Which brings us to the next question, which is probably one for you, Christopher, from Ronil Lau. Bula Ronil, hope you're well. Thanks for joining in. Ronil asks, how can we link data to access funding support for member states through the newly established loss and damage fund? And perhaps in answering that, where possible, if you can give some insights into the sorts of data requirements that would go into a proposal, I guess might be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think one that many of us have been seeking answers to. So the new fund was established at COP27, and it was operationalized COP28. And just last COP, they announced the new executive director of the fund, but no money has actually gone out the door yet. So far, various countries have been pledging. I think the pledges are around 760 million at the moment, but those pledges haven't all turned into contributions. So I think what the trust holds at the moment is around $350 million. And so the board met over the last week in Barbados, and they decided that it is essential to finally get resources to particularly vulnerable developing countries. And so they took this decision that by the end of this year, there would be a call for proposals launched so that countries can apply for support to address loss and damage. Now, the proposals will be in the range of 5 to 20 million each. And what the board is really looking for in this first release of funding is to try and test innovative solutions in some of the gap areas. And so those gap areas, they haven't been announced yet, but I imagine we're going to see things around non-economic loss and damage, things around displacement, things around slow onset events, probably direct access modalities. So putting money straight into the CROC or putting money straight into the Vanuatu Loss and Damage Fund, which we're setting up at the moment. So these are the novelties and innovations that I think they're going to be looking for. Obviously, you're going to have to justify how and why this money is going to be additional or bring additional benefit to what's already coming through with humanitarian finance or adaptation finance. You'll have to make some sort of a justification about why this is unique and special from loss and damage money. And I think the data is gonna drive home that message. So now would be the time for countries to start thinking. Obviously, this is a fund for developing country parties, but that doesn't mean that civil society and the private sector and development partners won't play an absolutely critical role in coming up with these nationally determined programs that countries will submit. So now is the chance for all of us, I think, in the Pacific, to be carefully considering how we could use some of this initial disbursement, 5 to 20 million each, and really operationalize some of the things that we've been now experiencing and thinking about to address loss and damage.
Wonderful, Chris. Thank you so much for that answer. Very helpful. Just while I'm here, just to let the people know, if you're in the watch party and you have a question, Lapani, if you can put your hand up right now to let people know who you are. Anybody in the watch party, if you have a question, Lapani can type it into the Q&A for you. Our next question, we have about 10 minutes still, so plenty of time for questions. Comes from Pasha Carruthers from SPC. Hi, Pasha. Good to hear from you. She has a question again, I guess talking about the other side or a different approach to the loss and damage issue in the context of where there's a lack of funding for addressing the environmental impacts. Again, this is a question open to anyone. What would you say is an activity around nature-based solutions to address loss of ecosystem services that could be funded? If anybody has a question, an answer, sorry, to that.
I don't know if this is helpful, but I could explain from Fiji's experience. We have explored the adaptation fund for some of the sites that we had done initial scoping for relocation, and the recommendation from the initial screening assessment was if they had a seawall, it may prolong the need for relocation. And one of these communities is going into the adaptation fund, the recently approved adaptation fund that will be funding nature-based seawall to be implemented by SBC. Executed by Waterways. So that was one of the avenues that you can also explore nature-based solution and tap on other funding that is available to help these at-risk communities and try and potentially avoid the need for relocation if that can be helped. Yeah, just sharing that example if that's helpful, Pasha.
Thank you, Lamba. Does anybody else want to jump in on this one?
Can I come in just very quickly?
Go ahead.
Maybe. I think this goes to Pasha's second point. What would be some of the data needs evidence base that you think would be required to access such funding for ecosystem services in the context of forced relocation? This is actually something that we're starting to look at much more closely in terms of the linkage between forced migration and displacement on the one hand, and nature-based solutions and rehabilitation of ecosystem services on the other. We'll start a study that will include at least 1 or 2 countries in the Pacific on this specific question, hopefully in the next few months. So maybe through Tim or Lepani, we can have a conversation about this, because I think it's an emerging area and something that we miss in terms of NBS as a potential solution to, or a way to prevent some of these issues around forced displacement and unwanted migration in the context of climate change.
Thank you, Brad. And Pasha is in Suva. So you're in Suva, Pasha, or New Caledonia? I can't remember, but hopefully in Suva, and then you can catch up with Bradley when he comes to visit. And in fact, Brad, we might have to provide another opportunity for you to give a public presentation so people can tap into your skills and experience. Lemba, oh, I saw your face. I thought you had another question or comment. This is a question from Jutta, Jutta May. How can we strengthen, enhance governments to firstly enhance in government's dedicated skill and data capacities, and secondly, collaboration for data to address relevant cross-cutting issues? If anybody has any, the point was made, I think, by Natha, that capacities within government for data collection and use are sometimes quite limited. So what recommendations do the panelists have for enhancing that capacity, as well as collaborating across governments in the region to address capacity limitations?
If I can just come in here, Tim, to share some example in some of the countries that we've worked in the past, like for Tonga, for example. They have legislated the establishment of cluster mechanism. So there's a dedicated cluster now on displacement and evacuation center management, with a supported dedicated officer that is currently being supported through IOM project. But the idea is to then absorb it into the form of in the formal government structure. And then quite similarly, and I think Lemba can confirm this with Fiji, with the setup of the planned relocation unit, and having to have that governance structure actually helps in terms of bringing in the needed capacity to do that with the terms of reference that includes a lot of the monitoring and reporting for both of these positions. That would help a lot in terms of plugging in those data and evidence gap. Just so some of the recent example that I can cite to respond to this question immediately, but to reiterate again the point that there is a bigger capacity gap that we need, to effectively monitor and consistently monitor and report on displacement and other forms of climate mobility. Thank you.
Thank you, Natha. Does anybody else want to chime in on this one? Nope. Okay, there was a question by Liam Moore. We've got 5 more minutes. In light of the value of granular and contextually specific community level stories, how do we balance bottom-up approaches of knowing what individual communities are facing with the top-down approaches of large-scale data collection? Perhaps Lemba or Brad might want to answer this one.
Oh, what's the question again?
So I guess it's around balancing the nuances of the data at the local community level versus, scaling up that data to make government decision making. How do we balance those in the decision making processes?
Yeah, I guess there's two things here: capturing the stories of the impacted communities. A lot of those lessons are captured when we either when we are doing the consultations in the communities or when we have workshops where we bring community representatives from communities that have previously relocated and communities that are being assessed for relocation and those that have put in their submission requesting for relocation. So we have a roundtable discussion where they share, communities that had been relocated would share their experiences, basically what was beneficial with the move and what were the challenges that they faced, both that prompted the move and what they're still facing probably at the new site as lessons learned to inform or advise both government and the communities that are considering relocation of the realities of some of these challenges and the nuances that are involved. So a lot of these lessons are captured during those workshops. There's a lot of workshops that are done, not just by government, but also a lot of other partners that work in this space where we plug into those workshops. We also participate in those workshops to try to collect as well this feedback that's coming in from the communities. And there's a lot of this feedback that has informed the SOP and other subsidiary reports that often come out from the government, as well as come into discussions when we have our technical sessions, that not the high-level government task force, but I mean, more at the technical working group level, where a lot of the other partners also bring in their views and sentiments that they are bringing in from the communities that they operate in. And of course, a lot of these are then captured and informed, like some of the key reoccurring messages on what are the major areas that need improvement. So there's that, but then there's also the collection of data that government does through the Kobo toolbox when we go out into these communities. That's necessary to ensure that we have all this comprehensive process that we are collecting all this information and that's aligning also with all the concerns that came through from the previous relocation of the previous 6 sites. So of course there's the 2 avenues of collecting feedback, and a lot of these are then shared during workshops and during other meetings of the technical working group and in the publications that come out of these meetings or the publications that we have to support the SOP that's there on the Fiji Climate Change portal. We have also recently done like a lot of interviews with various journalists, various researchers, also communicating the same issues, the same message, and how we also expect that the SOP is a work in progress, and there is a process there at the 3rd stage where every community relocation needs to capture the lessons learned from this on how it can inform government's processes moving forward, how things can be strengthened still. So it's an iterative process, and we expect that the SOP in the future, after we've relocated a couple of more communities, build better, because we're learning as we're doing, and we're grateful for the support of all the partners that are part of the technical working group, GIZ, PDD, IOM, and all the other players that help support all this other work that's helpful in bringing out these key lessons and key takeaways. Vinaka.
Thank you so much, Lemba. And we've put you on the spot so many times to answer questions, and it's wonderful that Fiji always has an answer. So thank you so much for, again, sharing Fiji's experience. Just before we close, I apologize to Malcolm, Tim. G'day, Tim. How are you? And Chovesa, Bulavinaka Chovesa. And Teresa, sorry, we're not going to be able to get to your questions, but maybe in the last few minutes, if any of the panelists would like to type an answer, then please go ahead. But before we close, I just want to hear, as I mentioned, this workshop is happening on the eve of a regional consultation on developing an implementation plan for the regional framework on climate mobility. So for each of the speakers, perhaps if you could leave us with some parting words of wisdom as we go into our consultation, any last words that you'd like us to take on board. So firstly, Brad, please.
First of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you today. And I'm looking forward to the follow-up that was discussed with a few people here today. I guess in terms of parting words, I mean, I think the Pacific is already quite advanced in terms of taking on board these issues, these specific issues related to population movement, displacement, migration, etc., in ways that we don't see, frankly, in other regions of the world. So already you're well ahead of the game. But I think as it relates to, the expansion of the ways that we can collaborate, both, some of the points that were discussed, from international institutions all the way to community groups and community experiences, etc. All of this needs to be, these are all important actors, especially from the bottom up, I think. So to whatever extent financing can be unlocked for local adaptation, financing can be provided to local institutions, etc., and the solutions being driven by local institutions, I think, is hugely important and hugely effective. And we've seen this, I think, in a number of areas of our work, as well as a few of the comments and questions today. Obviously, as it relates to data, more needs to be done, but I think there are key points in terms of grounding it. There was a question or a point on data sovereignty and ownership of data and access to information. These are hugely important issues, and I think then focusing on not only some of the well-documented issues related to hazards and to exposure on some of these sorts of data sets, which are obviously hugely important, but also some of the more intangible issues related to non-economic loss and damage, cultural connection to land, and so on and so forth. All of these issues, I think, are more difficult to capture on the one hand from a data perspective, especially at a sort of macro level, but are hugely important to understanding people's aspirations, people's challenges, and what they would like to do, I think, as they adapt to climate change in the future. So these issues, I think, are important to keep in mind. Thank you again so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Brad, and thank you for joining us. Lemba has dropped out, but that's okay. I think she's shared enough for today. Nada, any final comments?
Thank you, Tim, and thank you for having me in this webinar. I guess moving forward, and as we think about the implementation plan of the regional framework, what's important is, one, we need to position this this whole climate mobility agenda within the plethora of other development agenda that we have at the moment. We know our context is developing states with capacity constraints, and I think practically moving forward is to think what's already existing, and we've done so much. So not only in terms of implementing the plan, but also in terms of strengthening the monitoring of climate mobility issues that we have at the moment, particularly displacement, is to work through our existing systems, existing monitoring tools and mechanisms and methodologies, instead of creating something new altogether, just to be able to manage our capacity, our resources, and particularly the already fatigued communities that have been over-consulted at times. So I think that's critical, and it responds to one of the questions that was raised in terms of the plethora of other methodologies and tools that are available at community level. And and just think integratedly in terms of instead of sectoralizing climate mobility, think of it in the broader context of the development agenda, in order to leverage other financing that we have at this point. Thank you.
Excellent, Nada. And finally, Christopher, any words for our participants going into the workshop in the next couple of days?
Sure. I think I'd like to encourage the regional action plan, implementation plan, to really think about the principle of subsidiarity, which means that everything important decisions need to be taken at the level closest to where displacement is actually happening, which means the regional plan needs to think about national actions, and national action needs to be based on village and community action. I think this is so important also for financing. We need to make sure that money for addressing displacement is flowing to national governments, and we need to trust the systems of national governments and the national systems that are in place for dispersing that money. And we have to get money directly in the hands of communities that are facing displacement, planning and thinking through displacement. The idea that we can't trust Pacific Island communities, or we can't trust Pacific Island governments to handle money or disperse money or manage money has to be thrown out. So I hope that this principle of subsidiarity really is the heart and soul of the regional implementation plan.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Chris. And it was raining hearts and thumbs and claps as you were saying that. So it certainly resonated with the audience. Everybody, that's the end of our webinar. I want to thank the panelists again for sharing their knowledge and experiences. It was a wonderful conversation. Thank you to all of you online for your participation and for your questions. For the people upstairs in the watch party, I hope there's some food left over and some alcohol. I also want to thank IOM and Lapani in particular, and Angela for your collaboration on this webinar, and also for the UN High Commission for Human Rights for supporting the webinar as well. Keep a lookout on the PRP, the Pacific Resilience Partnership Facebook page for a recording of this webinar, and we look forward to your participation when we have our next webinar in a couple of months' time. Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much.